AAP has been very fortunate to have an enviable talent pool and it has attracted the brightest young minds towards it. One such guy is our guest today, Roshan Shankar. Son of high achievers, Roshan, despite having two graduate degrees from Stanford University in engineering and public administration, decided to become a first-generation politician. Roshan today is in the thick of action in Delhi politics after being advisor to the Delhi government and already worked with three ministries, water, environment and education. He started out as a volunteer for the party like all of us here, doing calling campaigns, etc., until he decided to take that jump one fine day and join politics full-time. One of the key members of the Delhi Commission, Delhi Dialogue, helped draft the all-important citizen-centric progressive AAP manifesto, along with other AAP greats, Ashish Khaitan and Meera Sanyal, among others. It is one of his tasks to ensure that the manifesto becomes a reality, despite pressures from all quarters, including the bureaucrats. He has been the all-important contact between Delhi government and the high-profile lawyers who won us a major victory in the Supreme Court recently. Please join me in welcoming Roshan to our show. Roshan, we'll start from there because I think we have got a fresh energy. We all of us have become suddenly very energized after the Supreme Court judgment. What was it like for you?
So thanks so much, Jaswant, for making this happen. Thank you, Vijaya, for the call yesterday as well as the conversation today. It's very, very good to reconnect and talk to the Aam Aadmi Party community abroad. It reminds me a lot of the Ghadar party during the freedom struggle. There's a whole bunch of people out there fighting for what's right in whichever way they can. So I think it's very important as well as very good to have a conversation with all of you. Thanks for the very generous introduction as well. I think a lot of I'll only disagree with the sole points of contact or an important contact. I think there's a lot of people who put in a lot of effort, but I think you were absolutely right in poking on the right question. Yeah, absolutely. So I always like to clarify because sometimes it becomes important to recognize a lot of people, and maybe I'll answer and maybe recognize them in my answer as well. So the Supreme Court judgment changes things quite a bit. So I came back to Delhi in June 2014. As you said, that was part of the campaign where we made the consultative manifesto for Delhi. In implementing that over the last 3.5 years, I can pretty clearly say that we had a free hand at governance for only about 6 to 7 months. And that's the first 6 months of the government. You should remember that even before we assumed office, two very critical things happened. Prime Minister Modi took office in the government of India, and he passed a notification on 22nd July 2014 that was trying to restrict the powers of the Anti-Corruption Bureau. So even when Delhi didn't have an elected government and was under the LG, the central government sort of knew that there was a certain mood that Delhi had towards the Aam Aadmi Party and what would Aam Aadmi Party do if they came to power. The second thing that changed drastically was on 23rd March 2015, which, if I'm not mistaken, was about a month and a half into our government, where they explicitly stated via an order from the Ministry of Home Affairs and said that the Delhi government cannot touch any central government employees using the Anti-Corruption Bureau. So only for about 6 to 7 months, and about 4 or 5 months later, we saw a whole host of powers being taken away from the Delhi government in various ways, which I'll enumerate. So this is just the background. So you have to understand that even while we are, when we are thinking about the great AAP victory of 67 seats, there's a significant portion of the bureaucracy as well as the political parties that are in the central government and other states who are sort of wary of AAP coming in as a new, honest alternative to both politics and governance. That's one. Two, I think we had a real government with the powers that maybe Sheila Dikshit had. And when I say a full government and a full elected government, I only refer to the powers that the former Chief Minister of Congress, Sheila Dikshit, had. I'm not referring to a full state at all right now. So only for 6 months where all our anti-corruption bureaus, all our different policy works were running on time and as per at least the schedule that our government wanted to work on. The next 3 years has been a lot of delays, inadequacies, as well as many deviations from the political vision of the executive. which have been either done by the bureaucracy by commission, sometimes by omission, but mostly by direction of the Lieutenant Governor, who is nominated by the central government and the Ministry of Home Affairs. So that is just a little bit of context on the political structure of Delhi as well as the history. I think just off the cuff, since you asked me the positive question first, how does it feel? I think it feels really good to be validated by the Supreme Court. These are very troubling times for our democracy, where we've seen 4 eminent senior Supreme Court justices come out and talk about the functioning of our judiciary as well. So I'm not going to say that I wasn't wary or even afraid of a negative judgment coming in from the Supreme Court. But I'm very, very glad that they have sort of held what democracy means to a large extent, and also furthered Delhi's development along by handing back the democratic reins of power to the Aam Aadmi Party, which won 67 seats.
You know, since you were watching...
What do I feel about... Yes.
Yeah. Sorry for interrupting, yeah. Roshan. I just wanted to know, since you were right there, why do you think the High Court interpreted the powers of the Delhi government so differently from the Supreme Court? It was a complete contrast.
Yeah. Yes. So I think there are a few variables which I can talk about rather clearly, and a few variables which are, I think, open to conjecture or hypothesis or just wild goose theories. So I probably not talk about the latter, but I think in the former, I think definitely the very fact that this was a constitutional issue and not a civil or a criminal issue was something that really changed the way these cases are interpreted. So I don't think the High Court is or was the appropriate place where such a case would get decided. But I think I think the High Court is not a place where constitutional matters should be decided. I think there the judges took a very literal meaning of the law, as well as didn't have the sort of stature to even give a judgment on the central government and the Delhi government. I think that's one, is that a constitutional matter should have been listened to and sort of pulled up by the Supreme Court before itself. But I think just because of the fact that we really wanted Delhi's powers to be restored as soon as possible, we went to the Delhi High Court knowing that there would be relief in the Supreme Court. Second, I think one major thing that changed between that time and now is, I think, the effect of governance as well across the city, right? So in the last 2 years, you've seen garbage across the city. That is the problem of the MCD. There are large landfills which are completely, they look as big as maybe the Sequoia National Park mountains look like, but they're all garbage. And that's also clearly attributable to the MCD. There's the air pollution problem that the city has sort of suffered from. And it's very clear that the Delhi government and the Aam Aadmi Party have wanted to move on all these issues very, very clearly. So even in the 2 years of judicial memory, I think, people have been able to see the bad repercussions of not having a government have the power through democracy as opposed to nomination. So I think people have seen, and this is also very true, even the courts are filled with judges who are people. And in the absence of very clearly demarcated rules of both engagement as well as communication with petitioners, respondents, as well as governments, I think that the judiciary has also been able to see how problematic it is to not have a non-elected official, a selected official of the central government in charge of any state. So this is not a problem of a party or the other. So I think first thing that I would say, this is not a victory of the Aam Aadmi Party. This is a victory of one Delhi, the rights that citizens have and the franchise that they exercise. I think second, it's a victory for democracy in a real sense. And third, it's a clear victory for what Aam Aadmi Party has been saying, which is that having powers in front of the elected government clearly changes things. I think just to complete the point as you ask your next question, I think the things that are conjecture or theories are all related to the people who are involved in the cases, whether they are lawyers or whether they are courts. And I think while I do have theories, they're not well backed by reason or facts. enough for me to say them out loud. But I think definitely the way you argue a case, the way teams are formed, the way judges hear certain cases. So I think one very clear and important thing for listeners in the US, in UK, and NRIs abroad is that our courts are not as the hallowed grounds as you think they are. And what I mean by that is the processes in which arguments are made, written submissions are made, the way arguments are heard, there's a lot of discretion, even in the hands of judges, in the hands of lawyers, in the hands of the court processes, in the way the roster is listed. There's just so many places where discretion is left up to the courts that I think even that not having very clearly laid out processes makes it easy for interpretations in both process and law to go any way that they'd like.
Okay, Roshan, what difference has it made to the Delhi government now that we have got the win? You had mentioned that, okay, things are moving, but not so much. So,
absolutely.
What changes have you noticed?
I think over the last absolutely. So I'll lay out my answer in 3 steps. So I think first is what happened when we lost powers. So we lost when the central government has taken away 3 key things before this judgment had happened. So they've taken away the Anti-Corruption Bureau, which has still not been returned, which means that we're not doing a lot of anti-corruption cases and arresting people like we did in our first 6 months, and there have been numerous investigations regarding the same as well. Second is they took away the services department, and that is sort of like the human resources department in any organization. So the head of the Delhi government didn't have the human resources department of the Delhi government till this judgment came out, which is, as you can imagine, very, very important for any organization to run well. So I think that has come back, to a large degree of extent, and I'll say why or why not. And third, it has been made eminently clear is that the central government has only jurisdiction on on the 3 subjects that are laid out in the Government of NCT Act of Delhi of 1994, which is land, police, and public order. What this does for the government immediately is I think first, before the judicial or the legal processes take up, is the environment around the Delhi government has changed. I think one, it has been very clearly laid out to the people of Delhi. So I think the mood of Delhi itself has changed. A lot of MLAs have told us that people also understand, because this is constitutional issues and legal issues are very difficult for us. So you can only imagine what a citizen who has nothing to do with this issue feels like when they only hear constant battles. So I think it's changed the mood of Delhi, which has changed the attitude of a lot of citizens as well as officers, even officers who didn't understand what was happening in this case. And that's I would say more than 90% of officers in the government also didn't understand why the Delhi government wasn't getting powers. I think a lot of them has finally understood the nuances of it just by the virtue of talking for so long. Second, I think a lot of bureaucrats, while I do believe that there have been a few bureaucrats who have actively derailed the plans that the government has, a majority of the bureaucrats have not sort of taken an open stance against the government or derailed anything. They are bureaucrats who came into the Indian Administrative Service with a want to do good, and they've not been allowed to by either the MHA or the Lieutenant Governor or by laws. I think that has completely changed. So a lot more officers, you might see a lot more press releases, you might see a lot more pictures of meetings between the Chief Minister, the Deputy Chief Minister, with the respective bureaucrats regarding these issues. I think that has started, which means that conversations on governance have improved. So
the central government is likely. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Finish.
So and just let me just complete. Yeah. So and the last part, which is I think dramatically changed, is that the way in which I think a lot of files as well as old processes. So these are things that we've been planning for the last 2 years. A lot of projects, a lot of policies, a lot of schemes. A lot of them have gained immediate traction. So they had, while their budgets were allocated and their reasons were formulated before, I think a lot of those projects have started coming out. So you recently heard the Chief Minister announce projects, a whole host of projects on water and sewerage augmentation worth 5,000 crores. Now which is the annual budget of the Delhi Dialouge, that had been delayed for a few months. Similarly, a lot of policies and schemes like the anything from thinking about governance in education, around the mohalla clinics, adding beds to hospitals, remodeling dispensaries as polyclinics. All of these have sort of just gotten the green light signal. So I think that changes a lot of the brass tacks of both governance as well as the outcomes that we want to deliver across Delhi.
Okay. You had also mentioned the central government is likely to file a appeal on the judgment, a revision, right?
Yes.
What do you
Yes.
A review? Sorry, review of the judgment. So what do you think would be the outcome of that? Yeah. What do you think would be the impact it would have?
So I think the central government, I've at least heard a lot of what the case has been about in the Supreme Court since it came to the Supreme Court. And I think it's a few things are very clear. I don't think the Supreme Court, the central government has a really clear idea about what argument they're making when they say that the elected chief minister doesn't have value. I think, and I'll give you an example. The Additional Solicitor General of India, Maninder Bhatt, in the Supreme Court said, and this is one of their arguments, which is Delhi is a part of India. India is run by the central government. Thus, Delhi must be run by the central government. This was an argument, and I'm not even kidding. They labored this argument for about an hour and a half in the Supreme Court, right? So, and while all of our lawyers, including Gopal Subramaniam, P. Chidambaram, Indira Jaising, Rahul Mehra, and across time, K.K. Venugopal, were all arguing on the rights of democracy, constitutional functionalism, pragmatism. They were arguing absolutely illogical things, in at least what I think. So I think their plan to file a review in the Supreme Court is already underway. That is also a manner or a tactic to ensure that things keep getting delayed. I don't think they're looking for relief. And this is a very cynical and a rather direct view that I have. Because once the Supreme Court has decided, and I think this judgment was absolutely clear on where it was going.
Still not clear on the services part, right?
Right. So I think even in the services bit, the issue is that I think the bureaucrats have realized, and at least as many of the bureaucrats that I met in the interim have very clearly said that we always believed that this was the right way to do things. But it will give bureaucrats who do not want to work with us to have the leeway or the sort of the open. They will sort of get the option to not work or come to meetings, and they will use that as a quotation to save them from any punitive action. So I think the review is more of a delay tactic in governance. I think it's very well established both with the citizens of Delhi, who I think it's well established that the Delhi government has won and the LG should not be making decisions. So these are just ways to keep delaying the inevitable end and the inevitable functionalism that they have to deliver to the Delhi and its citizens. But I think I've been, I always believed that the Supreme Court would hear this case very quickly and would deliver a judgment very quickly, right? And this was what I believed in maybe about 2 or 2.5 years ago. But even the Supreme Court delivered its judgment about 26 months after hearing this case. In the interim, they delivered judgments on the national anthem to every issue. And similarly, they had already reserved judgment on this issue about 6 months ago, which means that they had already decided what to do, but they didn't give the judgment out for another 6 months. So I'm very afraid of even very boldly saying something that the Supreme Court will quash such a decision, or they will not entertain any such review, or that any judgment will not go any other way. But I think just the precedent that has been set by the 5-judge bench in the majority decision as well as the explanations make it very clear that the Delhi government has eminence as well as has the democratic power to run a government in Delhi. Now, whether things change in the future, I would just say that it's a very low probability that it will change the current decision, but it will definitely be used as a delaying tactic by people who don't want to work.
Okay, Roshan, since we are on it, there's just one more question before I open the floor for questions. Why do you think, because this has not appeared anywhere, why did you, what is the reason Supreme Court held back the judgment, kept the judgment in reserve for 6 months? No journalist seems to have asked that. And after this question, others can ask their questions, and I'll interject in between. Thank you, Roshan.
Definitely. So I think on this specific issue, I do not think anyone has anything other than conjecture to offer. We are pretty, I can give my conjecture, which is that there was a constitutional crisis in the courts. I think there was a lot of different cases that were happening in the courts that sort of implicated both the Chief Justice as well as a lot of other justices were also involved in those cases. So I would theorize that given the Judge Loya case, given a lot of cases that sort of made the Chief Justice as well as the central government look in terrible light, it was seen to be better to reserve a judgment rather than also admit another defeat at that same time. So in an odd way, you want to space out your defeats as opposed to ensure that all of them come together. I think that is my theory. I think everyone is entitled to theirs.
Well, since the judgment was already taken, I don't see the logic behind it because the judgment was already done.
The logic is that when you delay it, yeah, absolutely. I mean, short of just abusing Supreme Court justices, I don't think there's any other conjecture that is valid. For 6 months, they said nothing. I think they should have, but yeah. I think all the NRIs will not get into any trouble, but I'll get into contempt of court here if I say it.
Okay.
So the central government filed a petition to preview the judgment. So in that period when the judgment is being reviewed, so how the function of the Delhi government will affect?
So I think it's, I'll answer this with two simple words. I think there's two concepts called de jure and de facto, and those are Latin words for de jure is what is by law, and de facto is what really happens. By law, after this judgment has come out, the Lieutenant Governor should not refer any matter to the President unless it affects the nation of India. Every bureaucrat should directly report to the Chief Minister, and the Deputy Chief Minister should attend meetings as per the protocol that is there. And even the centre filing a review means nothing. The judgment is there already, and that stands as the law of the land. Now the problem with news media, things like this, and I'll say this with two examples. When on 8th August 2016, the High Court ruled that the Lieutenant Governor is the head of the government, right? Mm-hmm. When you have a central government which also agrees with the same dispensation, and they also control the bureaucrats, from the next day onwards, very few bureaucrats would come to meetings, right? The same vigor has not been seen in coming back to meetings. So they would, as soon as the judgment came that the LG is the head of the government, I've seen hundreds of files by commission or by omission going to the LG directly without even being shown to the elected head of the government. While now, what this does is, the de jure is that the Delhi government is the elected head of the government and is the head of all the bureaucracy should report to them for work. But and that's the law of the land, de jure. But de facto, what can happen, and this is just theory, I don't think there is any evidence to state this, is that people who are pliant to the central government, and there are a few, and I can unequivocally say that there are, will use this as an excuse to say that this issue is not fully laid out. Just like I think we've already seen it with the services issue, is that there are some IAS officers who think that services is not back. When the Supreme Court has defined the positives, which is Delhi government has control over everything other than these three issues, there's no reason why they should still contest services. And yet the central government and the MHA and some officers, and I would say it's less than 5% of them, literally natural number, but just that some of them are senior, are contesting this issue. So I don't think the review in itself will hurt at all. I think the lack of absolute clarity as Delhi government gets back services, which was not there in the Supreme Court judgment, as is rightly, because it's a constitutional judgment, not a civil criminal policy-based judgment, has been interpreted poorly by some people. So I don't think the review in itself will affect things a lot, but the way in which the judgment was framed and the fact that the central government chooses to interpret it in a certain way might affect it quite a bit.
Yeah, Roshan, this is Amrit. Thank you for your time. On this issue, have the IAS Officers Association made a comment or observation to their officers on how to proceed?
To be very frank, I don't think I've checked their Twitter handle, but I don't think so, which is quite odd. And it's a very important question that you ask, as well as I think a question that journalists should ask first. But I don't think there has been any formal comment from the IAS Association yet. But I could be wrong on that since I have not checked their Twitter handle for a while.
So recently, the Saurabh Bharadwaj has made a press conference. I think he did yesterday about the ex-chief secretary of Delhi. I forgot the name. So he went to High Court for not appearing against the petition committees. And then present Chief Secretary Anshu Prakash also went to High Court for not appearing in front of the petition committees. But the High Court says, no, you have to appear, otherwise action will be taken. So present Chief Secretary Anshu Prakash, he went to High Court just for not appearing in front of the petition committees, or there was some other reasons as well?
So I have not worked or seen that particular case or issue very well, so I don't want to make a comment on that. But I think it's very clear that so I think I'll start with a broader comment first. I think AAP believes that the executive and the legislature have independent as well as important roles that are separate. So I think the legislature has its own permanence and its own values as well as its own powers, which is also something that the central government has cut down on. So just the Supreme Court and the Delhi government issue, there's also an issue of the Supreme Court, of the central government leaning on and exercising its weight on the Delhi legislature, which is the Delhi Assembly. And as much as these days we think of both Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister as well as the leader of the Lok Sabha, while they are the same person, they are two different roles. So I think that's the first very large degree of separation that we have. Because of the second issue that I'll see in that issue is that AAP has also pushed a lot of interesting and innovative legislative reform in the last 4 years. So one, we did not raise the salaries of the MLAs. We had proposed that a committee be formed which would recommend it. So actually, the legislature has not increased the salary for the first time. In every state government and in every national government, MPs or MLAs vote themselves to raise their salaries. I think Delhi Assembly is the first assembly in India. I know that Delhi is the first assembly in India where the MLAs have not voted to raise their salaries themselves. They put it to an independent committee and they have not been raised. Second, Saurabh Bharadwaj as the chairperson of a few committees and a lot of other committees have tried to make their hearings open. Just like in the US, you might have Senate or committee hearings about the elected executive. So you have Trump's hearings going, the lawyers of Trump, the executive members of Trump's cabinet being questioned by both Senate and the House. We've tried to bring that level of transparency as well. So the Delhi Assembly has been the first assembly to get officers to answer questions in public. And the MLA Saurabh Bharadwaj has led a lot of initiatives around making the legislature more transparent, which is also something that has sort of not gone well with both the bureaucracy as well as the central government. And the third sort of issue is that the LG also had attempted to remove the secretary of the current speaker of the Delhi Assembly. And while this does seem preliminarily as an AAP issue, it's a very serious issue that the executive is sort of leaning on the assembly, which represents the voice of the people. So these three sort of data points do clearly show that the central government has been leaning on the legislature, which has again been sort of shown by a lot of our MLAs, chiefly led by Saurabh Bharadwaj from GK, who has shown through the petitions committee, through the estimates committee, through the public accounts committee, and trying to bring a sort of democratic accountability even to the executive. So while the Chief Secretary Anshu Prakash is the Chief Secretary of the current AAP government, the AAP MLAs in the legislature have tried to bring in another check and balance, which is how our three-pronged way of governance, which is judiciary, executive, legislature, is supposed to function. I think it's a very progressive step. I think this judgment that they have to be answerable to the legislature as well is very, very progressive and very important, because it also brings the voice of an MLA, who represents sort of a section of the city or the section of the state that represents them, and makes them to be as a legislator more than just as the silent vote to everything done by the government. So I think it's very important that AAP has done this, and that they have been able to expose a lot of the, anti-democratic stances that both bureaucrats like Mr. Anshu Prakash as well as the LG have taken. And I think it's very, very important for the government, whether elected, whether IAS officers, whether Daniks, to be answerable to the legislature. And I think this is a very, very good step in that direction.
Just one clarification, Roshan. What the MLA salaries you mentioned, which committee is it before? Which committee is supposed to go through it?
So we had nominated a 3-member committee that was led by one of the former Secretary Generals of the Lok Sabha. I think his name was Mr. PDT Achari. So they were all independent and separate bureaucrats who have nothing to do with us, have all served either in the central government as lawyers or as in the parliament as experts on the constitution. And they actually recommended, this is I think 2 or 2.5 years ago, they recommended that the salary should increase, which was taken up by the media as the salary has been increased. But very oddly, all our MLAs still make the same salary as they did in 2014. So while we've probably not done very well in managing the PR around it, I think it's been a very, very good legislative as well as democratic process of how should an MLA, I think it's a very core question, right? Can your elected representatives raise their own salaries from the taxes that you pay? If that is true, then the government is not we the people, it is them the government, or them the MLAs. And I think bringing that also under sort of some amount of democratic accountability to some expert scrutiny, and still taking a decision, even if the committee said one way or the other, the legislature voted the other way. So it's not necessary for that, but I think the process in itself is very redeeming for democracy in Delhi.
Okay. But since the committee is appointed by the government itself, it would still be in the Delhi government.
The legislature. Again, the legislature. Okay. So the legislature appoints the committee. Yeah. So I think that key issue, just because I think the 67 has sort of made us forget that the government and the legislature are different, because we see most of our friends and a lot of good people in both places. But I think the legislature had done it separately. So I think then it didn't become an act because the legislature didn't want to pass it.
Okay.
And this committee was selected out of where? Out of just people or elected representatives?
I don't remember the 3 names, but no. So they're all experts on the constitution from either parliament or the central government from the past. So they're retired past experts. So PDT Achari was one of them. I don't remember the other 2, but I think I can find you their names somewhere.
Yeah, please. So 2019 is not very far. What are the chances for 7 seats in Delhi region? Let's not talk about rest of the India, just focus on 7 out of 7 in Delhi region.
So I think over the last 3 or 4 years, I would say that AAP has been able to make a unique brand within Delhi. So I think most of the conversation that exists across the country is whether a party or a person is good or bad. And I think while it is important to discuss that on 1 or 2 dimensions, citizen outcomes have been clearly missing. So if you see the Congress narrative or the Federal Front narrative that is going, it is that BJP or a single party is bad, or Prime Minister Narendra Modi is bad for India. While I do agree with that, it is not enough to spin a positive narrative, or that's what I think. Similarly, the BJP narrative has been that you've seen what Congress governments have done and what has happened. I think in Delhi we've been able to craft a unique narrative where, interestingly, a lot of BJP supporters think that we are Congress's B team, and a lot of Congress supporters think that we are BJP's B team. And that dichotomy only exists because we created a new narrative which is purely based on citizen outcomes. So over the last 4 years, we've been able to make tangible changes to people's lives. So imagine an unauthorized colony or a slum in Delhi which in 2014 did not have water, electricity, education, and health. And I know that we talk about these four things most because I think these impact a large part of the citizenry together in a cross-platform sort of approach. So about 32 lakh households have benefited from the power subsidy that the government has given. There have been about 350 new colonies with about at least more than 20 lakh people who have received water or a water pipeline, either or, for the first time in this government. Education has, obviously, you've heard the news and the revolution that Mr. Manish Sisodia and Atishi have been able to usher in to the education system at the school level, which means that a lot of people who are sending their kids to a private school, some of them have changed. They've seen government schools become better. And also health systems. I mean, these are all small wins that accumulate over periods of time. So more than 40 lakh people, unique visitors, have visited a Mohalla clinic out of the 162 that exist across Delhi. So I don't want to make any predictions about 2019 or 2020. Another thing, one last thing just before that. We've also lost an MCD election in Delhi in 2017, which was partly anger at the AAP, could be anger at people, but it was also because if you did surveys in Delhi, more than 55% of Delhi thought that the MCD is a department of the Delhi government, right? That in itself had not been established. Now, those narratives are changing, and finally people are able to see the components. So if you talk to an average auto person about 4 years ago about the failings of the MCD or the DDA, which are everything from planning to civic management to garbage management, those were all attributed to the Delhi government before. I think people are able to pretty clearly see what components are working and what aren't. So given all this context, I think very, very clearly if we fight a good grassroots election where a lot of volunteers and our MLAs work with the communities and fight the election at the grassroots in a very Bernie Sanders kind of way, where big money doesn't play a huge role. I think there's a certain amount of corpus or a certain degree that you cannot, that sort of like a critical mass of money that you need to fight an election. But after that, it will be how we are able to project the wings of our government. And I'll give you a small example of how this works. So, for example, in East Delhi, there is Mr. Manish Sisodia's constituency, Patparganj, where a lot of tremendous work has happened on many fronts, from roads, from schools to different water pipelines, to every sort of civic amenity that you think that the Delhi government can provide. Old age pensions, social welfare, youth loans, right? Now, in that same area, let's say there's a water pipeline that's being laid. What would happen is, let's say Mr. Manish Sisodia, the Deputy Chief Minister, is busy in some meetings related to education in the government. He will probably not go to, he's also not the kind, I mean, he's a very gentle, genial sort of person, and he doesn't really want the credit for a lot of work. But what happens on ground is that the BJP councillor would probably reach the place at which the inauguration of the water pipeline is going to take place. And what would happen is, the people would see the BJP councillor. He would say that I've been able to push this, I pressured the government to do this, and I got it done. The political credit of the work that the Delhi government does has not necessarily translated into political outcomes as well. So if we've been able to push projects, sometimes we've not been able to take credit. And I think, as bad as that sounds, very, very saying it out loud, I think taking credit for what you do is as important as the work that you do itself, at least in this political ecosystem. I think if we are able to clearly communicate how we are doing work to the people that we are doing work, both on ground and then in the air, I think it's very much like Border, the film. Sunny Deol cannot fight alone, and neither can Jackie Shroff from the air, right? So you both need the ground forces as well as ammunition and support from the air. I think if both work together, you can take on any army of any size. But if you fail on either front, which is not having a good enough grassroots campaign or not being able to have the modern ammunition of electoral war, which is social media, large funds, communication, campaigns, etc., I think if we solve both of them, I do not see a reason why Delhi should not vote all of its both MPs as well as the next government in 2020 to power.
I think Delhi got potential. That's why they gave 67 seats out of 70. So it's just now our election machinery team should work that the work done on the ground are translated such that the people, they don't vote for the liquor and money. That's the only thing. If we focus, we will have really good chances.
Okay, Roshan. So that brings
Absolutely.
us
That's a very important point.
managing perceptions, which we have not been able to do, which is surprising because we have a huge online and offline army, working voluntarily for us. We should be able to manage perceptions too. Why is it not happening, and what is going to be done about it?
So I think there are a few things. So, and I get asked this a lot because why were we able to win 67 seats and yet not be able to win something else after, or win something else now, or why are you not able to do this? I think there's, at least in my opinion, there are two possible answers to that. I think the first is that obviously as an organization, we've gone from sort of being a startup to being a mid-sized company with startup goals, right? So we're somewhere at the decision maker level of what a Netflix or a Valve in the US looks like. So we have a large base. We have many states in which we have significant presence. Many more states where we have a significant want for the AAP to come in. And there's a sort of resource as well as a product crunch problem where you have to also see that AAP has done well where local leadership and local support both coexist in some way or the other. I think that's one. Two is that maybe to some bit, I think it's also funds. I think over the last 3 or 4 years, politics in India has gotten extremely professionalized. So in 1998, Pramod Mahajan started the concept, in 1998 to 2003, the Vajpayee government was there. The India Shining campaign was in 2003 was the first one where even the word called a war room came in, right? And even before that, there were a lot of professionals in policy coming in. But I think the 2014 Modi election, just the infusion of corporates like Adani, Ambani, and a lot of different corporates who fund elections, as well as the, changing face of technology, which has sort of made micro categorization as well as targeting much easier, whether that is Cambridge Analytica on Facebook, whether that is robocalls, all of those machineries have sort of come in. So I think the war has gotten a lot bulkier over the last 4 years, wherein, as a very simple example, if you wanted to show a citizen of Delhi a Facebook ad of what artwork was happening in 2014 or 2015, the cost per click or the cost per conversion, CPC and CTR, a lot of the social media metrics used to be very low. Let's say about 50 paise per click or action. Now that number has gone up because a lot of political parties, a lot of advertisers are using the same mind space to advertise that issue. So while we are communicating it, it is not reaching at scale because there are people who are outbidding and outcompeting the same work. As another example, I can say that in the Punjab elections, our social media team had a huge ground presence, even the social media team, and I'm not just saying the ground presence, but our total money spent on social media ads was about 200 times less than what the Akali spent. And this is the party that had already sort of left ground. And this number I've heard from various sources within Facebook and without as well. I think that, as I said, there's a critical mass that is needed, and also the second, which is just the ground support. I think we are also capacity constrained like any startup is. So you have MLAs who are also, so Saurabh Bhardwaj, the person we spoke about on this phone, right? He's trying to go and try to look at the way in which bureaucrats are running the government in their limited capacity, right? So in that same time, he's not in Greater Kailash when he pursues this issue, which from where he's an MLA. Now, in those 3 or 4 days, maybe, and this is not just related to governance. People, citizens also think about every part in which MLA plays a role in their life, which could be attending birthday parties for social credibility, which could be attending funerals, which could be attending marriages, and Saurabh is not there on these 4 or 5 days, which gives opens up the spot for a lot of other political operators to enter, right? And if that happens over a sustained period of time, while the issue may be getting resolved, it takes away the mind space. So I think the third issue is just capacity at being able to create both on-ground impact for the party and most importantly that we're a volunteer-driven organization. I think that's also something to remember. AAP has most of its volunteers and even advisors like me who are either paid very little or are not paid at all, right? And that's a choice, and that's also an interesting choice in many ways for many different roles. But what ends up happening is people have to figure out their lives as well. So sometimes I think, as I was telling a friend of mine a few days ago, I think we do much better in wartime because we all know that there's a problem, and that India has gotten more unequal, and it has gotten more violent, and that it has gotten more corrupt over time. And we know that we have to fight that problem. But there are many who have to figure out their lives as well, and whether that means. So in a very odd way, I don't think AAP have been able to discover its charkha, right? Gandhi's charkha, which was supposed to make people have Swaraj, which is determination of their own lives. That creation of alternatives has not happened for our volunteers in some sense. And that's not by design. It's not something that we plan for. It has to be something that happens. I think a combination of these three reasons, both which leads to employee attrition, which leads to volunteers going to different places, starting different things, are all sort of combinations as to why. And I think most importantly, there's also social media can only do so much. There are newspapers, there are, the fact that it has been a no-brainer for the longest time for journalists that the government should have been under the elected government on all issues except these three. It should not have taken the Supreme Court to keep hammering down this issue. But very few journalists, almost none, took this issue up for the last 3 years. And I think if the Chief Minister had not taken the steps that he did, if he had not gone on a dharna at the LG's office, if he had not refused funds to the MCD, if he had not done a lot of things that people think are irritating to a point, people would not have actually realized that there is a problem in the way in which Delhi is governed. So while, and you're also fighting, while the reporters and the journalists might agree with you, that this is the issue, editors and the management of newspapers and channels do not necessarily subscribe to your view. And more importantly, they are not allowed to subscribe to your view by the political dispensation. So if the newspapers aren't saying what you are, and if the TV is saying something different, and if everything is saying something different, our social media can only have a certain amount of reach. While we must endeavor to do better, I think it's also important to remember a few of these variables that keep changing over the years as to why we've not been able to be as successful as we were maybe 3 years ago in winning the election.
Okay, Roshan, we are aware of that problem, but what is the solution to that? That is a big question.
Yeah.
Can I add in over here?
Yeah, so this call is also for all of you to think about how this problem can be solved. I think.
So this is one thing. This is one thing that I talked about even when Mr. Reddy was around. So what you are really facing from a macroeconomic level is an economy which is becoming more and more capitalistic. Basically, if you have money, if you have a job, you have things in India. If you don't, then you're disenfranchised. That's the kind of mindset that's moving into India. While the democratic process is in place to counter something like that, the democratic process is actually democracies were found at a point in history when the narrative was very much in favor of capitalistic, not only capitalistic but also these colonial powers, which means a country doesn't have either political power or any kind of power. All that happens is their tax money goes into the pocket of another country. So that's when democracy was formed, even by the countries which were themselves the benefactors of this money. So that's because money in a few hands, it can be controlled by anybody. I mean, we can give this entire money to Ambani, or we can give this entire money to Modi, and they can control the whole thing. You just put money in banks and you have it just for yourself. But that's not the best way to use money. that's not the best use of money. And one of the things what happens as soon as the very centralized capitalistic structure tends to appear, and anywhere in history, whether it's the British East India Company or these big and powerful iron and coal and mining companies, people are disenfranchised from that financial gains. So what you have to do is you have to talk about not only in terms of political power, that but also in terms of these missing financial gains, while Ambani, Adani, everyone is growing. At some point, non-cooperation. I talked about to Mr. Reddy. It sounds a little bit CPM-ish, but hey, if you are taking away from the people are going to get more CPM-ish, right? So
absolutely.
So you have. I mean, one of the things that I clearly visually saw, and I'm this far out, but I could visually see that before, and I don't know what, and you said Supreme Court had reserved its judgment. I tell you how Supreme Court or anybody would reserve a judgment. They would have two sets of judgments. If people wake up and they start crying, they give a good judgment. It's like the mother giving milk to the kid. If the kid is not crying, which mother would give milk to the kid, right? It's from my point of view, it was the fact that on Father's Day, there were like, on 4th of July, there were like 40,000 or 50,000 odd people on the streets of Delhi, that you got that judgment. If it wasn't, that judgment would be different. So it's Aam Aadmi Party's power with the people. It's standing for a counter narrative to this kind of very bad kind of economic situation that India is being put into, just with power. I mean, how many startups are there? How many? Yeah.
I have one question to Roshan.
Yeah.
Sure.
Roshan, this is Jeshwan. Hey, we have spoken, a lot about governance and about the party. So whenever I have any questions to the volunteer, it's only about the party. Because I am connected with the party from sitting here. So what I feel is we all are in a war room here, and we are lack of a strong connect on the ground. So we are missing that a strong connect. So what I feel is like you lived in this part of the world, and you know very well how we feel. Okay, you are in our shoes actually. So what I feel is you are the only stronghold for all of us. You are on the ground. You are actually on the ground. You know the facts on this ground. So what I feel is we want you to be a stronghold for us, and you feed us, and we are here to get things done for you. So can we work on those lines to make it what we are missing to spread the government what
this is
something
this is something which I had asked you yesterday, Roshan, that we do not have clear directions how we can extend our help. That's the thing. I think that's what even
so mainly even before going for the directions, so the directions can come from a person from a strong hold. I mean that's what I mean to be if I say like we don't have any foreigner who went back onto the ground and who is working, and it's only you. So how do we make that fill this gap, fill this bridge between the country, between the India and US, and get this work done?
I don't think I have a clear answer to that immediately. I think, but I can say two things. One is, so I do understand what it does mean to be outside and very concerned about things in India, and also about people in a political party. So it's sort of a extended family that you don't see for a while, and you sort of visit them once in a while and attempt to help them in every way possible, but not being there is an issue. But the flip side of it, again, sort of goes back to the capacity constraint that a lot of people have. I think definitely Prithvi is doing a really good job in sort of igniting sort of the NRI support as well as the community which was there and is still there in trying to make that bond stronger. I think definitely I'm happy to help in whichever way I can, but I'm also wary of how much time can be given. So I was just before this conversation also, I was coming from a meeting with a bureaucrat or two before I took this call, and it's sort of a Sunday evening right now, and the World Cup is going on right now. So things are not necessarily. I've also seen on ground here that a lack of contact is and I've seen several. I've been on a lot of those Google groups where a lot of nasty emails have gotten sent in the past. Whether it was Prashant, Yogendra, a whole bunch of names that. I mean, it's always about people, unfortunately. But I think the work of the government is being done and is being put up on the pages and through press releases as well as the party. I think they can. I always believe that we can always do better. And I'm. If anyone wants to talk about that, I'm happy to share my suggestions with whoever that is the decision maker in this issue as well. On the immediate front, I'm going to be volunteering with, and I say volunteering. I've sort of had different roles with the government as well. I've been a paid advisor, an unpaid advisor, an unpaid secretary, and now a volunteer because the Supreme Court judgment. You don't know whether all of us will get reappointed or not. Now the issue is, and oddly, I don't even know whether I'm still an advisor or not. So that's the sort of paralysis that exists within the government. So you've not seen my names in any of the government orders that have removed advisors, but I've also not formally. There's still a sheet of paper that's somewhere. So as a volunteer, I'll be helping the Water Ministry and the Health Minister over the next 6 months. And the Health Minister has been doing some phenomenal work in Delhi. I mean, you've heard of the amazing work that has happened in education, in water, in electricity. But I think there's a real interesting space in education, in healthcare as well, where, I mean, you've heard of the Mohalla clinics, but everything from the ways in which our hospitals are functioning much better, to the way drugs are being procured, to the way in which schemes for the poor have been executed. I think all of them have sort of will need more ground assistance as well as technical assistance in some way or the other. So I'm happy to find a way in which maybe order, like maybe work or maybe communication about the work, or maybe the brass tacks of governance can be communicated or explained far better to the sort of NRI community as well as community at large. So on the immediate basis, those are things that I can probably help with. But yeah, I think this is an ongoing problem as well, right? As your family sort of becomes bigger and there are more stakeholders as well as interested parties in knowing about you, the communication complexity will sort of increase. You need to get different sorts of people that the right kind of message. So I've heard that there is a volunteer kind of messaging, there's a donor kind of messaging, there's an advisor kind of messaging, there's a citizen kind of messaging, and in that sometimes there are delays. But I think we can definitely. I think it's good to start in a small place. So maybe there's some way in which we can brainstorm over the next few weeks to do that better. But hopefully help can come from different sources and in different ways to help that become stronger.
Okay, this is the longest I think we have had any discussion with a guest, Roshan. So all thanks to you.
Okay.
And I think we need to let you go
pleasure.
now. Yeah, it was a pleasure having
absolutely.
you. And thank
you so much for this call.